The man who asked God for an understanding mind ended his life bowing down to pieces of carved wood and blocks of stone. The story of King Solomon is one of the most perplexing narratives in all of Scripture. If you are familiar with the Bible, you know the highlights of his resume. He is the architect of Israel's golden age. He is the primary voice behind the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. He built the first glorious temple in Jerusalem, creating a permanent resting place for the presence of God. His beginning is legendary. When God appeared to him in a dream and offered him anything he desired, Solomon did not ask for wealth. He did not ask for a long life. He did not ask for the death of his enemies. He asked for wisdom to lead God's people well, and God gave it to him. 1 Kings chapter 4 tells us that God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, a mind as vast as the sand on the seashore. The text says his wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. Kings, queens, and scholars traveled from the edges of the known world just to hear him speak. But if you turn just a few chapters later, you hit a wall. In 1 Kings chapter 11, the narrative shatters. The wisest man in human history is suddenly building high places for Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites. These were deities associated with horrific ancient practices. Solomon is burning incense to the idols of foreign nations. He is turning his heart away from the God who appeared to him twice. His actions fracture the kingdom of Israel so deeply that a civil war eventually erupts, tearing the nation in half. It is a tear that will never fully heal. How does that happen? This is not a story of a foolish king making a predictable mistake. This is the story of a genius dismantling his own empire. How does a mind capable of writing the profound truths of Proverbs justify building a pagan altar? How does human wisdom fail so completely? Usually, when people read the story of Solomon, they read it as a tragedy of two entirely separate halves. We tend to think of the good years and the bad years. We assume that somewhere near the end of his life, Solomon just grew old, lost his edge, gave in to the pressure of his foreign wives, and made a sudden, tragic mistake. We view his idolatry as a bizarre, late-in-life departure from an otherwise faithful reign. But that is not how the biblical authors constructed the narrative. The writers of 1 Kings do not isolate his downfall at the very end of his life. Instead, they carefully weave the clues of his rebellion right into the descriptions of his greatest successes. When you read the text closely, you discover that Solomon's fall was not a sudden accident. It was a slow, deliberate, and highly organized descent. What looks to the world like brilliant economic strategy, military expansion, and diplomatic genius is actually the quiet architecture of his ruin. Every major achievement in his golden age carried the precise mechanism of his destruction. But to see this hidden pattern, we cannot start with Solomon. We have to go back hundreds of years before he was even born. Before Israel ever had an earthly king, God gave Moses a blueprint in the wilderness. He laid out a very specific, ancient law for what a king of God's people was supposed to do, and more importantly, what he was forbidden to do. God gave 3 specific rules for the throne, just 3. And when you know what those 3 ancient rules are, the entire story of King Solomon changes. His golden age suddenly looks like a warning. Hundreds of years before there was a throne in Jerusalem, before there was a temple, and before Israel even had a piece of land to call their own, God knew what was coming. He knew that one day, his people would look at the surrounding empires and demand a king. They would want a monarch they could see, a kingdom they could measure, and a military they could boast about. So, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, God gave Moses a very specific set of instructions. It is often called the Law of the King. It was a blueprint designed to make sure that whoever sat on the throne of Israel would never turn into a pharaoh. God did not give a complex, endless constitutional document. Instead, he gave 3 simple, binding rules, not 10 commandments. Just 3. First, the king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. Second, the king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Third, the king must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. That is the entire list. No multiplying horses, no multiplying wives, no multiplying wealth. If you pause and look at those 3 rules through the eyes of the ancient world, the prohibition is staggering. Think about what God is actually outlawing here. Horses and chariots were the ancient equivalent of advanced military technology. They were the tanks of the ancient Near East. To ban the multiplying of horses was to forbid the king from building a massive, unstoppable standing army. Multiplying wives was not primarily a warning about romance or private morality. In the ancient world, royal marriages were how a king signed peace treaties. When a king married the daughter of a foreign ruler, it was a binding political alliance. It guaranteed that the two nations would not go to war. To ban the multiplying of wives was to forbid the king from securing the nation's borders through human political strategy. And accumulating silver and gold? That is the foundation of any empire. It is how a ruler funds his building projects, pays his soldiers, and projects power across the region. To ban the hoarding of wealth was to forbid the king from turning Israel into an economic machine that relied entirely on its own treasury. Military power, political alliances, economic dominance. These are the exact three pillars that every successful nation in human history has used to build an empire. And God looked at the future kings of Israel and told them they were forbidden from relying on any of them. The king of Israel was supposed to be completely different from the kings of the world. His security was not supposed to come from the size of his cavalry. His peace was not supposed to come from his diplomatic marriages. His stability was not supposed to come from the gold in his vaults. His only security, peace, and stability were supposed to come from a radical, daily dependence on the God of Israel. God was saying that if you build a kingdom the way the world builds a kingdom, you will eventually become just like the world. This ancient rulebook was not meant to be a secret. Deuteronomy chapter 17 says that when the king takes the throne, he is to write out a copy of this law by hand, keep it with him, and read it all the days of his life. Solomon knew this law. As the wisest man on earth, he knew exactly what was written in the sacred scroll. But knowing the law and trusting it are two very different things. When we turn back to the story of Solomon's golden age in 1 Kings, we are usually blinded by the glare of his success. We read about the trade routes and the construction projects, and we assume God is just blessing him. But if you keep the 3 rules of Deuteronomy right next to the text, the narrative transforms. The golden age begins to look like a quiet rebellion. Watch what the wisest man in the world does with the very first rule. The first rule in the ancient law was simple. The king must not acquire great numbers of horses, and he must not make the people return to Egypt to get them. God was very specific about this. Deuteronomy chapter 17 includes a direct warning from God. You are not to go back that way again. Why Egypt? Because Egypt was the house of slavery. Egypt was the empire of Pharaoh. Egypt was the exact system of power and oppression that God had rescued his people from. To go back to Egypt for military hardware was to say that God's deliverance was not enough. It was a failure to trust the protector of Israel. Now, fast forward to the golden age of King Solomon. If you read 1 Kings chapter 10, the text describes the sheer scale of Solomon's military expansion. Verse 26 tells us that Solomon gathered together chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. He had so many that he had to build entirely new locations just to house them. They were called chariot cities. But the devastating detail is not just the number. It is where he got them. Verse 28 says, Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt. And it gets worse. He did not just buy them for his own defense. He turned it into a massive royal business. Verse 29 tells us that his merchants imported chariots and horses from Egypt and exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Aram. Do you see what is happening? The wisest man in the world is systematically breaking the first rule of the ancient law, and he is doing it openly. To the surrounding nations, this looked like brilliant leadership. Solomon was modernizing Israel's military. He was securing the borders. He was making sure that no foreign empire could ever threaten his people again. He was building an iron wall of chariots around Jerusalem. It looked like peace through strength, but biblically, it was a tragedy. Solomon was sending his people back to the very place God told them never to return. He was rebuilding the exact military structure of Pharaoh. Under the guise of national security, Israel was slowly transforming into the empire that once enslaved them. This is the danger of human wisdom when it is disconnected from the fear of God. Human wisdom is incredibly efficient. It builds excellent supply chains. It secures profitable trade routes. It creates impressive defenses. Solomon used his brilliant mind to organize the perfect military machine. He just ignored what God said. He traded divine protection for Egyptian warhorses. And once you cross that line, the other rules are much easier to break. A massive military requires a massive budget. Chariots are not cheap. Standing armies require constant funding. And so, the narrative moves seamlessly from Solomon's military expansion into his economic policy. The first rule was completely broken. The second rule is about to fall right alongside it. God had commanded the king not to accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. But Solomon's global trade network was bringing in a staggering amount of wealth. And the writer of 1 Kings does not just say he was rich. The writer gives us an exact, specific number for his annual revenue. It is a number that should make every careful reader of Scripture pause. In 1 Kings chapter 10, the biblical writer documents the peak of Solomon's economic empire. Verse 14 says, "The weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold." That is a staggering detail. 666 talents. Depending on the exact historical measurement, that is roughly 25 tons of gold in a single year. And that was just his baseline revenue. It did not even include the tariffs from traveling merchants, the taxes from traders, and the tribute money from all the surrounding kings. The biblical text goes out of its way to describe this overwhelming, suffocating abundance. Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. He made 300 smaller shields of beaten gold. These were not meant for battle. Gold is too heavy and too soft for war. These were display pieces, meant to hang in the palace and blind visiting diplomats with the sheer wealth of Israel. He built a massive throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps, and 12 carved lions stood on the steps. The writer notes that nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. All of King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold. 1 Kings chapter 10 tells us that silver was not even considered valuable in his days. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as ordinary stones in the street. It is an image of absolute, breathtaking human success. But remember the ancient law from Deuteronomy chapter 17, the blueprint for the king of God's people. God said, the king must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Why would God forbid an overflowing treasury? Because extreme wealth creates a dangerous illusion of independence. When a king has 25 tons of gold arriving every 12 months, he no longer feels the need to pray for his daily bread. When he sits on a throne of ivory and surrounds himself with golden shields, he does not feel vulnerable to the empires around him. Wealth builds an invisible, heavy wall around the human heart. It whispers that you are entirely secure, that your power is self-sustaining, and that you no longer need the God who gave you the kingdom in the first place. Solomon did not just bend the rule against accumulating wealth. He obliterated it. He turned the nation of Israel into a commercial superpower. He replaced a daily, radical dependence on God's providence with the predictable, calculated security of a royal bank account. And the most dangerous part of this stage in his life? He did it all while looking like a completely faithful king. This is the subtle terror of Solomon's golden age. He is still the ruler in Jerusalem. The temple is fully operational. The priests are still offering daily sacrifices. From the outside, the kingdom looks perfectly blessed. The surrounding nations are traveling for months just to marvel at his wisdom. But underneath the surface, the king has quietly replaced the foundation. He has broken the first rule by building a massive, Egyptian-style military. He has broken the second rule by hoarding an unprecedented empire of gold. He has the chariots. He has the treasury. He has secured the nation exactly the way the pagan kings of the world secure theirs. But there is a third rule left in the ancient law. And it is the breaking of this final rule that will eventually bring the idols into Jerusalem. Solomon did not just want to secure his borders with iron and gold. He wanted to guarantee peace through human diplomacy. And in the ancient Near East, the ultimate diplomatic tool was marriage. He has the chariots. He has the gold. He has broken the first 2 rules of the ancient blueprint. But empires are rarely sustained by military and economic power alone. To hold a massive kingdom together, you need diplomacy. You need guaranteed peace with your neighbors. In the ancient Near East, there was one primary way a king secured a border. He did not just sign a piece of parchment, he signed a marriage treaty. This brings us to the third and final rule from Deuteronomy chapter 17. The ancient law stated that the king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. When we reach 1 Kings chapter 11, the narrative delivers a staggering statistic. It says King Solomon loved many foreign women. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, 1,000 women. When modern readers look at that number, they almost always read it as a story of unchecked lust. They see a king who simply lost control of his private appetites and surrendered to indulgence. But in the ancient world, a royal marriage was not a romance. It was a political maneuver. When King Solomon married a princess from a neighboring empire, it was a binding international alliance. It was a guarantee of non-aggression. An ancient king would not declare war on the nation where his daughter lived as royalty. The marriage created a human shield around the kingdom. The biblical text is very specific about who these women were. It says they were from the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. These were the surrounding nations. These were the exact empires that had historically threatened Israel's borders and oppressed God's people. Solomon was not just building a harem, he was building a web of international security. He was securing every border, every trade route, and every mountain pass with a diplomatic marriage. To the politicians in Jerusalem, this must have looked like pure genius. Solomon had created an era of unprecedented peace without having to fight a single major war. He was using his legendary wisdom to outmaneuver the hostile nations around him. But biblically, it was a devastating betrayal. Remember what God was trying to prevent in the law of the king. The king of Israel was supposed to trust God to protect the borders. The king was supposed to rely on divine defense, not human strategy. By multiplying wives, Solomon was looking at the peace God had graciously given him and deciding he needed to secure it himself. He traded the promise of God for the political guarantees of pagan kings. And the tragic warning from Deuteronomy was incredibly precise. God did not just say, "Do not multiply wives." He added a consequence. He said, "Or his heart will be led astray." When an ancient king married a foreign princess, she did not come to Jerusalem alone. She brought her royal court. She brought her culture. And most importantly, she brought her gods. To honor the treaty and maintain the political alliance, the king of Israel had to provide a place for his new royal wife to worship. Every diplomatic marriage was an open door to a foreign idol. It is easy to look back at this and wonder how a man given supernatural wisdom could be so completely blind. How does the man who wrote the book of Proverbs justify compromising the core identity of God's people? The text does not give us an internal monologue. It does not record a private journal entry where Solomon explains his logic. Instead, the biblical writer does something far more subtle. To show us the true state of Solomon's heart, the text gives us a quiet, architectural clue. It gives us a comparison of two massive building projects. And once you notice the numbers in the blueprints, the depth of his compromise becomes impossible to ignore. How do you measure the internal devotion of a king whose external life looks perfectly faithful? The writers of 1 Kings do not give us a psychological profile of Solomon. They give us an architectural one. To show us exactly how the heart of the wisest man in the world was slowly drifting, the biblical text places two massive building projects side by side. It gives us a simple comparison of time, size, and resources. At the end of 1 Kings chapter 6, we read about Solomon's crowning achievement. He finishes the temple in Jerusalem. It is a stunning, glorious resting place for the presence of the God of Israel. The text tells us that it took 7 years to build. For 7 years, the nation's resources, craftsmen, and focus were directed toward honoring God. But the very next sentence introduces a stark contrast. 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 1 says, Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. 13 years. It took nearly double the amount of time to build his own palace than it took to build the house of the Lord. And it was not just a matter of time. It was a matter of sheer scale. The biblical writer gives the exact dimensions of Solomon's royal complex, known as the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon. When you compare the measurements, Solomon's house was significantly larger than God's house. It was massive. It required entirely new levels of taxation and forced labor to complete. This detail is not just ancient history. It is a profound theological diagnosis. Solomon did not abandon the God of Israel. He did not tear the temple down. The priests were still offering sacrifices. The incense was still burning. The festivals were still being observed. He simply built something for himself that was vastly larger, more demanding, and more consuming than what he built for God. This is the subtle nature of compromise. Spiritual drift rarely begins with a loud, sudden rejection of truth. It almost never starts with open rebellion. It begins with a quiet shift in proportions. God still had a place in Solomon's kingdom, but he was no longer the center. The temple was now just one beautiful building sitting in the shadow of a sprawling royal estate. Solomon was still giving God his due, but he was giving his empire his devotion. And this is where the multiplying of wives collides with his obsession with building. Remember, Solomon had brought 1,000 foreign women into Jerusalem to secure his political borders. To maintain those alliances, he had to accommodate their royal courts. He had to keep the foreign princesses comfortable. And a foreign princess from Moab or Ammon does not worship at the temple of Yahweh. She requires her own sacred space. Solomon's willingness to build a massive palace for himself revealed a heart that was already comfortable with compromise. He had already justified breaking the rules against horses and gold. He had already justified breaking the rule against foreign wives. He had already justified making his own house larger than God's. The boundaries of his devotion were already gone. His wisdom had become entirely pragmatic. It was no longer rooted in the fear of the Lord. It was rooted in the survival of his empire. And to keep his empire together, the builder king had to keep building. But this time, he was not building an armory. He was not building a palace, and he was not building a temple to the God who gave him his wisdom. This slow, quiet drift in his architectural priorities was about to bleed directly into his worship. He was about to alter the landscape of Jerusalem in a way that would scar the nation for generations. Just across the Kidron Valley, directly east of the temple Solomon had built for the God of Israel, there is a mountain ridge. Today, we call it the Mount of Olives. But in the days of the kings of Judah, it became known by a much darker name. It was called the Mount of Corruption, and King Solomon is the one who corrupted it. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 7, contains one of the most tragic sentences in the entire Old Testament. The narrative says, "On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites." Stop and think about those two names, Chemosh and Molech. These were not just generic ancient deities. Ancient Near Eastern history and later biblical texts associate the worship of these specific gods with horrific, unspeakable practices, often involving the darkest kinds of human exploitation. These were the exact practices God had warned Israel would poison their society and destroy their land. Yet, the man who wrote the book of Proverbs is now the one ordering the construction of their altars. The biblical text tells us, in verse 8, that he did the exact same thing for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Solomon had built 1,000 political alliances, and now he had to build the shrines to sustain them. But here is the detail that is easiest to miss. Solomon did not officially renounce the God of Israel. He did not close the doors of the glorious temple he had built. The priests of Yahweh were still operating inside the city walls. Solomon simply added other altars to the landscape. He tried to merge the worship of the one true God with the political pragmatism of the surrounding empires. He wanted the blessing of God, but he also wanted the security of his diplomatic treaties. He was hedging his bets. The biblical writer diagnoses this perfectly when he says, "His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. His heart was divided, and a divided heart eventually surrenders to the loudest idol." Imagine the visual tragedy of standing in Jerusalem during the final years of Solomon's reign. You could look toward the Temple Mount and see the smoke rising from the bronze altar of the Lord. And then you could turn east, look just across the valley, and see the smoke rising from the high places of Chemosh. The wisest man alive had turned the holy city into a spiritual marketplace. This is the final, fatal result of breaking the ancient blueprint. It did not happen overnight. It started with a logical, strategic decision to buy Egyptian warhorses. It moved to a brilliant economic policy that hoarded tons of gold. It multiplied into a massive network of international marriages. And it ended with the king of Israel funding the worship of Molech. Because of this betrayal, the text says God became angry with Solomon. God declares that the empire will be torn out of the hands of Solomon's son. The golden age collapses. The nation will soon fracture in a brutal civil war, splitting into two rival kingdoms. It is a tear that will define the rest of Old Testament history. But as the story of Solomon comes to an end, it leaves the reader with a profound, almost terrifying question. If the wisest man in human history could perfectly memorize the law, write the deepest proverbs, build the temple of God, and still end his life bowing to carved idols, what does that actually teach us about wisdom? And that question brings us to the final, beautiful reversal of the story. If the wisest man in human history could completely dismantle his own kingdom, what is the actual value of wisdom? We tend to think of wisdom as raw intellect. We view it as the ability to solve complex problems, manage vast resources, and outmaneuver our enemies. And if that is all wisdom is, then Solomon was undeniably wise. He knew how to organize an army. He knew how to run an economy. He knew how to negotiate a treaty. But the Bible defines wisdom very differently. In the book of Proverbs, a book traditionally attributed to Solomon himself, chapter 9, verse 10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight." According to Scripture, true wisdom is not just cognitive processing power. It is covenant faithfulness. It is a posture of the heart. The moment wisdom is disconnected from the fear of the Lord, it stops being biblical wisdom and becomes nothing more than human strategy. And human strategy is incredibly dangerous because it is highly effective at building things God never asked us to build. Solomon's life is not a story about a good man who accidentally made a mistake at the end. It is a terrifying warning about what happens when we use God's gifts to build our own empires. Solomon took the brilliant mind God gave him and used it to systematically break every rule God had established for the throne. He chose the predictable security of horses, gold, and political treaties over the vulnerable reality of trusting God. His wisdom became a tool for his own self-reliance. But the story of the kings of Israel does not end with the tragedy of Solomon. It points forward to a king who would finally get it right. Hundreds of years after the kingdom fractured, Jesus of Nazareth was speaking to a crowd in Matthew chapter 12. He reminded them of the Golden Age. He talked about how the Queen of Sheba traveled from the ends of the earth just to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And then Jesus looked at the crowd and said, "And behold, something greater than Solomon is here." To an ancient Jewish audience, that was a staggering claim. How could a traveling rabbi be greater than the architect of the Golden Age? Jesus had no wealth. He had no army. He had no political alliances. But that was exactly the point. Watch how Jesus fulfilled the ancient law of the king from Deuteronomy chapter 17. Watch how he succeeded exactly where Solomon failed. God commanded the king not to multiply horses. When Jesus entered Jerusalem to claim his throne, he did not ride on an Egyptian warhorse. He rode on a borrowed donkey. God commanded the king not to multiply silver and gold. Jesus did not build a treasury. He told his followers that he had no place to lay his head. His kingdom was not built on the taxation of the poor, but on the sacrifice of himself. God commanded the king not to multiply foreign wives for political security. Jesus did not secure his borders by marrying the daughters of pagan kings. Instead, he went to the cross to redeem a single bride, the church, drawn from every nation, tribe, and tongue. Jesus is the true and better Solomon. He did not just teach wisdom. The Apostle Paul tells us in the New Testament that Christ actually became for us the wisdom of God. Where Solomon used his wisdom to elevate himself and burden his people, Jesus used his wisdom to humble himself and set his people free. Where Solomon filled the holy city with the altars of foreign gods, Jesus went outside the city gates to become the final sacrifice. The story of Solomon is not just a tragic biography. It is a beautifully designed shadow, pointing us to the only king whose heart was never divided. His kingdom is not built on iron or gold. His rule does not rely on earthly alliances. His was not the wisdom of empire. It was the wisdom of the cross.